So I'd like to introduce to the audience a very special guest that we have today. She is an author, lawyer, mentor, serving as the team captain of the first U.S. women's Olympic team in rowing. She led the United States to winning the bronze medal in the 1976 Montreal Games. Following her time as a professional athlete, our guest made international waves as she opposed the intersection of sports and politics, culminating in the protest against the boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games. She later served as vice president of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee and was elected to membership of the International Olympic Committee, otherwise known as the IOC, becoming the first African-American woman to join the organization. And shortly afterwards, another leadership opportunity was thrust upon her in 1987 when she became the president of the LA84 Foundation for the next 28 years, overseeing a $93 million endowment from the LA84 Games surplus. And today, this inspiring figure continues to serve as a member of the IOC and as an influencer who continues to spread the positive spirit of sport and unity throughout the world. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Miss Anita DeFrantz. Anita.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that intro.
Thank you, Seth. Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
No, so I'm ready for the interview now with that wonderful introduction.
Thank you, Seth, for setting this up. Thank you, Mr. DeFrantz, for agreeing to the interview. So you participated in the Summer Olympics in Montreal in 1976, where you won an Olympic medal in rowing. 2 years after that, the U.S. passed the U.S. Amateur Sports Act, which changed the way sports was organized in this country. And the 1970s are also a time period where international sports, especially the Olympics, are dominated or under the shadow of the Cold War. A lot of things have changed since then. And I was hoping that you could maybe remind us of what it was like to be an Olympian in the 1970s, what it meant to compete, what motivated you to compete, and what the structural framework was that allowed you to compete in the Olympics.
I forgot your question. What was it like being an athlete having?
At this point in the 1970s in the US, because the structural framework was still very different. It's before the US Amateur Sports Act of 1978, which of course you testified in Congress for. But this is also still the time of the Cold War. So a lot of things have changed. So I think it's hard for younger athletes and younger generations today to imagine what it was like to be an Olympian in the 1970s under, when it was still like the time of amateurism. So could you just remind us of like what it was like, what motivated you to become an Olympian?
Yes, well, I will tell you that the 1970s, the late 70s, 1976, when I first came upon the Olympic movement, was completely different. And in fact, the only way you could tell you were an Olympian was once you got the gear, because the only way you got the gear was to be an Olympian. You couldn't buy it in sports stores like you can today, or at the USOPC sports store as you can today. You had to make the team to get the gear. So, of course, once we finally were selected to the team, we were waiting for the gear. When we got to where the gear was, it turns out they didn't have enough for the women's rowing team, which is what created me, because I somehow became team captain and responsible for getting the gear, which meant I spent time at the USOC then headquarters during the games, which I wouldn't have done otherwise. The games are an incredible event. It's you plop down a whole village on top of a city that may or may not be interested in having it. And the athletes come and they have food 24 hours. They meet one another, countries that you would never imagine sitting together at a meal or sit together for meals. And life goes on. For me, it changed the way I saw the world. I realized that we could live in peace. We could be fighting fiercely for something very, very precious that there's not enough to go around, and yet come back and share a meal in peace. So that was for me the proof that the world could be at peace. The Olympic Village is that very place where we can find peace throughout the world. So the games were different then. There were fewer athletes, certainly fewer women athletes. And in fact, the women were housed in one dorm, or one of the, I don't know if you remember the village, there were these pyramids, 3 pyramids. By the way, they're still there providing housing for the people of Montreal. So it wasn't that it was built and never used again. It's been used ever since. But putting the women all in one place and the men every place else was really not a good idea. And it made it more difficult for you to find out who were the men on your own team, especially after trading began and people started wearing each other's uniforms. So I'll tell you one thing that I did change for 84. I told them that we should not have a separate dorm for women. They said, fine, we'll tell the executive board. So I actually had to make the proposal to the IOC executive board, which was actually fun to do. I heard one member say extraordinary, another one say revolutionary, but you know, it was the right thing to do. It would give the number of beds that the National Olympic Committee needs, and they decide who sleeps in them. We have nothing to do with that. So that's the way it's been ever since.
Thank you for sharing that. I was wondering, so you do talk in your autobiography about competing against the Soviet Union, competing against countries from the Eastern Bloc, especially, of course, the East German team, because it is so prominent, it is so dominant, especially the women in a lot of the disciplines. But so now you talked about this transformative experience of like having or sharing a meal in the Olympic Village. But before you arrived in Montreal, was that a debate that you were competing against a different system in your team, or was it more important to just represent your country?
The US team is pretty unique. There is no pathway to get there. You have to figure it out yourself. And I guess once you've figured it out, you're so determined to win that medal. That's, at least in my case, that was the focus. I never thought of the bad guys or good guys. They were just my opponents. And that's the way it is in rowing. We don't think of, you know, for a long time, we didn't even recognize national flags because there were clubs competing. And that was the Society of Rowers, which is the French for the name of our federation. And we realized that when National Olympic Committees are funding the teams, they want to have their flags, and therefore we caved and decided we would do the national flags to help the teams get the funding they needed. But it's about respecting your competitor, because you know how hard you worked, you know how many times you did the stairs or ran the hills or lifted the tonnage or rode the miles. So you know that person in the lane next to you probably did much of the same work, and so you respect them. And you hope you'll be the fastest to get to the finish line first, but if you're not, you want to respect those that do. Now, the 70s, the end of the 70s into the beginning of the 80s was a time of doping. Let's just be clear. And unfortunately, doctors in the US were saying that doping didn't matter. That's because they weren't using the dosages, the amount that the bad doctors are giving, nor for the length of time. So for a month, it didn't seem that a steroid would make a difference. But during the whole time of training, it could make a significant difference so that you could train harder and recover faster. As I say, the East Germans and the Soviets probably had different jelly beans than we had in the US. And therefore, they were able to train harder, recover faster, and ultimately go faster than we could.
So most people remember the two boycotts of 1980 and 1984. However, you are in Montreal in 1976, where also several African countries actually arrive and then abruptly leave to protest the treatment or acceptance also of apartheid South Africa. I was wondering, so oftentimes that boycott is actually considered like the forgotten boycott because African countries played seemingly not such an important role in this Cold War era Olympics. And of course, there's some racist undertones. The idea that African countries aren't represented as much and they're not considered as relevant in the Olympic movement in those years. At least this is more or less the consensus in the literature. I was wondering what your memories are of that walkout, because you mentioned it not in your autobiography. So how did it feel for you, and how do you contextualize it now looking back to those years?
Well, I actually met a team that was on its way home. As I was waiting to get into the village, I just, was trying to be friendly, and there was a man who spoke English. I said, "So, you excited about the games? You're going to open in a couple of days?" He said, "No." I said, "Why not?" "We're going home." "Going home? Why are you going home?" He said, "Well, because New Zealand played with South Africa." And I said, "What? They played what? Rugby. They played rugby with South Africa." And now the interesting thing about this was not a boycott by the National Olympic Committees. This was by a government group. It was the African, I'm going to forget the name of it, but it was the government group that controlled the African nations, or it was the group that spoke for it. And so it was a government group in the sports sphere, which the IOC, we do our best to keep government out of it. And as it was, not every African National Olympic Committee stayed out of the games, which you actually competed. But unfortunately, a large number of them stayed home or went back home because of this government called boycott. And who wins? Did the government win? Was any government better off? Who wins? No one wins. Who loses? Those athletes who had prepared and actually were in Montreal, were prepared to compete. They were the losers. Who were the losers in 1980? The athletes who didn't get to compete. They prepared. They had perhaps had their fortunes tied to being successful at those games, but they didn't get to compete.
I mean, you have the immediate experience of like meeting a team as it's arriving and departing immediately. Do you think like the American audience, TV viewers, sports enthusiasts paid attention to that boycott? Oh,
I seriously doubt it. I mean, they barely paid attention to us. At opening ceremonies, the network broadcasting, whose name I will not say, went through commercial as the US team was marching in, because they didn't figure out that it was the French alphabet that was being used. So it was États-Unis, not United States. So they actually went to commercial as we were marching in. So I seriously doubt that that was a part of what, that was sports politics, which hadn't really created itself yet in the US public sphere, I think.
I want to move to the next Olympics in 1980. In January of 1980, President Jimmy Carter proposed to boycott these games nominally to get the Soviets to withdraw from neighboring Afghanistan. As you were one of the most vocal athletes opposing the boycott. Obviously, you also sued the White House for that decision. Was that boycott, the 1976 African boycott, on your mind? Did you use that as an argument that a boycott would be ineffective?
I never thought the US would boycott. I never thought that was something that could happen, because after all, we were private citizens. Not a penny of federal, state, or local taxpayers' money came our way. We were absolutely independent. So where was the connection to a government? There wasn't one. So I'd heard some some talk about us boycotting Montreal because there was some issue over China and Taiwan, both competing there, which is a whole nother story. But since we did compete there, that went away. But I did promise that athlete I would find out more about what had happened so I could better understand why his chance to compete had just been taken away from him. And I did. I learned a lot more about what was going on in South Africa and how I could help.
Could you elaborate on that aspect?
Well, as I learned about, I grew up in a family that was very much community oriented, and my grandfather was a great community organizer. My dad followed in his footsteps, and so I knew there was more than one thing happening at one time. Now I've kind of lost my train of thought because it's going in two directions.
How you got involved in the fight against apartheid in South Africa?
Correct. So I learned as much as I could. I read, and I met some wonderful people, including Richard Lapchick, who had been, whose father was a part of the integration of basketball. And also he himself suffered being beaten up because of his stance against apartheid. So when the LA84 endowment came into being, I pointed out that, of course, the IOC has shunned South Africa because of its apartheid stance, and that our investment should similarly shun South Africa. And so the board decided that that was a good idea and actually got Wells Fargo, it might have been still a different name bank by then, but essentially Wells Fargo, to create a non-US, it was a small cap, a medium cap fund instead of a big cap fund. And that fund did much better than the big cap, large cap funds did. And the foundation was solid and made a lot of money in the investments, but with no South African money in it, which made it much, much better. So that was one way that we got disentangled, and it was to our benefit.
A lot of athletes who could not participate in the 1980 Olympics became very influential people in the IOC or in the international federations. I mean, there's you, there's Thomas Bach, there's Sebastian Coe.
Coe took part. Coe was in Moscow. And in LA.
Exactly, because he defied the prime minister's coaxing not to attend the games, but it has clearly shaped his engagement and your engagement. I mean, the 1980 boycott is so transformative for all of you athletes, especially if these were like the last opportunities for you to participate. I was wondering whether that is something that, whether you think that you drew the same conclusions about strengthening athletes' voices in the Olympic movement as Thomas Bach did. Is that a moment, is 1980 a moment where you felt you could bond with other athletes in other countries? You talk about what it meant for athletes in the US in your autobiography. You talk about your friendship with Rayford Johnson, for instance. So the organizing around the lawsuit. But I was wondering whether you could talk about like what it meant, whether you communicated with athletes in other countries, especially those who then went on to have these careers as Olympic functionaries, basically.
Well, interestingly enough, we have the rowers, I don't know what to call it, but we rowers were like connected with even out the phone wires. I knew what was happening in the rest of the world in rowing. And that's how I knew that Europe was going to be attending the games, whether we were or not. So I kept up with that. And it's true, a lot of us who were burnt want to be around to make sure that the next group of athletes wouldn't get burnt that way. So you will find many of the crusaders from around different parts of the world in positions of responsibility, whether they became coaches at a university like Oxford or Cambridge, or whether they became officers of the International Federation of their National Olympic Committee. But once you've learned how this stuff works, you pretty much want to get involved to make it work better.
No, obviously you had a very tenuous relationship with the Carter White House, to say the least. You do mention, you share several anecdotes of meeting Jimmy Carter after the boycott, when the lawsuit had been unsuccessful. I was wondering whether we could talk about 1984, where obviously, again, you play a very prominent role in organizing the games in Los Angeles. Peter Ueberroth, in his memoirs of the 1984 games, they're published a year after the games, has a very ambivalent view on the Reagan White House, in the way at least he presents it in his memoirs. I was wondering what your perception was of the White House, the State Department, in the discussion of a potential Soviet boycott that was looming in the spring of 1984.
I was quite embarrassed by how little our government knew about the Olympic movement, because it wasn't a part of what they did. But they knew so little, and they didn't ask for information from the people who knew something about it. And that was really what was humiliating, that a nation like the US, well, it's because Olympians are individuals. It's not something that you sign up to be, and there's an Olympic Corps. In other countries, there might be a youth corps of kids who are likely to become their elite athletes later on, but that's not done here. We are actually individuals who find our way to be selected to be a member of the Olympic team. So those of us from 1980, though, have a special tie. And we still gather. We had our 41st anniversary because the 40th was messed up by COVID. But the rowers with the head of the Charles, and I forget, there were maybe 46 of us were there. And we know that if we are not, if we don't watch things, something bad could happen again. And it's for no reason. The changes that people want the Olympic Committee or the Olympic Games to change just won't happen. We do this as much as we can, but there are major things that the Olympic movement just cannot change.
Now, the LA Organizing Committee, as you very well know, made a distinct effort to maintain or develop positive relationships with countries on the African continent. Could you share some of your experiences with these efforts? Did you think it was sufficient? Do you think it was effective? There are a lot of concerns, obviously, around criticisms of racism in the US and in the Olympic movement. Could you share some of your thoughts on these aspects?
Well, very interesting. Well, the morning after the torch relay began, there was a meeting involving the senior staff of the LAOC, and Peter made assignments around the room. He said, of course, Anita, you're responsible for making sure that all the NOCs from Africa get to the games. And I said, of course, no problem. And I realized there were 45 National Olympic Committees in Africa, and making sure that all 45 got to the games was no small task, since I never left the country. But I used the friends that I'd made, and that's what the Olympic movement is about: trusting one another, trusting people, and convince them to be 2 airplane pickups where people could get to the pickups, because there would be major events at those 2 spots. And that's how we got a lot of the National Olympic Committees from Africa. In fact, we were only missing 3, and then the 4th left the day of opening ceremonies. Libya left that day, which was very sad. But otherwise, we had 41 National Olympic Committees from Africa at the Olympic Games in 1984.
During the LA Olympics, several disciplines were added for women, I think 12 in total. Did you have the feeling that female athletes were gaining a stronger voice within the movement, especially at the LA Olympics? And how did you feel about the representation of Black American women at the Games?
All right, well, there are two very separate questions. First, overall on women. I noticed, of course, there weren't a lot of women around. I was an admirer of Monique Berliou, who was the chief operating officer of the Olympic movement for years until President Samos became president, and then he wanted a different structure. So I knew there was a strong woman there. And I knew among my rowing women friends that we're all very intelligent, had gone to college, so why aren't we leading sports? And this began to make me wonder about what was happening in the world of sports, making it challenging. So I did stand for office in my own sport. It took the courage to do that, and was elected. And so I could talk the talk and was walking the walk that you need to get back to your own sport, that women have a great deal to offer, but we forget, if we're not asked, that we can contribute. And over and over again, I've learned that women need to be asked. Men just step up and say, this is mine, I'm going to take this. But women need to be asked if they'd be willing to do something. And that's, I don't know, that's just been my experience. I don't know if it's a scientific difference, but that's been my experience. So I was asked to do something, I did it. I asked others to do things. I'm very proud that in '84, we had close to equal opportunities for the Paralympics on the track. First time that happened at the Games. And we had the marathon for women and men. You know, of course, women can run a marathon. It's ridiculous to have prevented it for so long. And I can't remember exactly what other sports, but that was the beginning. Or maybe '76 was the beginning when finally women's basketball, women's rowing, and there was another women's team sport that was on the program for the first time. Team sports for women are important. Having a woman playing an individual sport, oh, that's just, she's someone different. But when you have a team of women, that's something completely different. These women have had to make, they're adults, they've had to make life decisions so that they can continue to be a part of the team. So that's a whole different thing that you're talking about. And it's important and needs to be recognized. And I'm very proud. Now, this was not '84, unfortunately, but I'm proud to say that for 2024, we'll have an even number of women and men competing at the Games, finally. We'll have close to an even number of women members of the International Olympic Committee, not quite 50, but maybe 40% of the IOC members are women. In the international federations, the leaderships, we're not doing as well as we should be. In the National Olympic Committees, we're doing pretty well. So we've come a long way out of the 19th century into the 20th century, and I hope the 21st century.
Did you feel that the American public was equally honoring its female athletes and its male athletes in 1984?
No, absolutely not. The U.S. public honors its gold medalists, and quite honestly, that's what every athlete wants, but that's all the American public is interested in, the gold. Many times people ask me, well, did you win a gold medal? And I say, no. And they kind of walk away and say, wait, I won a bronze medal. Anyway, Olympic athletes are not as famous as professional athletes in the US. professional athletes are entertainers. Olympic athletes are Olympic athletes. We have we pledge to compete with integrity. And once the competition is over, it's over. It's different from professional sports.
Yeah, in 1984, it's Carl Lewis, you know this, participates. He equals Jesse Owens' record. He's also one of the first athletes, Olympic athletes, to accept, as he also writes in his autobiography, very frankly, to accept gifts and money from sponsors. Michael Jordan placed in the first time in the Olympics when he's still just in college, right? So right. And then amateurism falls in the following years. How did you feel about that?
Had actually fallen in '73. It was taken out of the Olympic charter and replaced with the word eligible.
Exactly. So then it was a matter of decision for the federations. But still in '84, there are a lot of debates, especially around Carl Lewis, and there are a lot of, he was compared in Sports Illustrated, in the daily newspapers, with Edwin Moses, who was a different personality, was also portrayed very differently in the public press.
A different event.
Yep.
Yeah, completely different event.
Yeah. So how did you feel about these changes? Because you can still see in 1984 in reports on Carl Lewis, a lot of reservations against Olympians accepting money. Especially because there was the perception so dominant at the time that to preserve the integrity of Olympians, they cannot make money off their talent. Basically, that's one of the reasons why Bruce Jenner, you write about meeting him in '76, but decides to quit the Olympics and actually accept the Wheaties sponsorship and all that. So there are dramatic changes in those years. How did you feel about that?
Well. Nobody ever asked us at the starting line of the rowing events what our bank accounts were. So, and if they saw mine, they'd laugh because there'd be nothing in it. There might be two women behind me might have been very wealthy. It didn't matter. What mattered was your ability on the field of play to be competent and so forth. So for most athletes, we wanted to know who the best was. That's why I happened to speak up when tennis was being considered. I said, well, it's not their fault that in order to find out who the best is, you have to play the Grand Slams. Why should they be denied the opportunity to compete in the Olympic Games? Similarly, athletes in other countries were being supported by their countries. We had this kind of old idea of amateurism where you spring full grown and become a skilled athlete in the sport, and then nobody's ever had to help you get there, but you're ready to compete for the U.S. team, which is nonsense. So much work goes into it, but nobody wants to look at the work behind the scenes because not everybody makes it. It's really hard to make the U.S. team in every sport. Every sport.
In 2017, you introduced the bid for LA to host 2024. It became 2028 Olympics again. In that presentation, you reference, of course, the success story of 1984. Ronald Reagan, in August of 1984, so just 2 weeks after the closing ceremony of the Games, actually elaborates at length on the success story of LA84. Peter Uberoth becomes the Time Magazine Man of the Year, and so on. So it is celebrated also in the scholarship as this great success story. Did you also have this impression that really changed the mood in America?
Mood in America. Wow. We have a very large country. And I can't say that. I think if people talked about it, if someone brought it up, it'd be, oh, yeah, that was really good. I think in Southern California, it made us feel like we were one unit. And before, we have so many towns and townships, and whether you're in the city or in the township, whether it's a sheriff or a police department, a lot of that went away because we were all hosts. for the 1984 Olympic Games. Now, as for the entire country, I know the torch really helped bring the country together too, which was, again, Peter's willingness to take that risk. Peter Uberoth, by the way. Brilliant. I'm so glad he was the president. I don't know how we could have done it with any other president than Peter. He's the right man at the right time. So that brought together, but America is so busy that I really it would be tough for me to think that it would be a moment for the whole country, except maybe at closing ceremonies as they were watching it. That would have been a moment for the whole country.
You've done a lot for Southern California and LA, especially through the LA84 Foundation. How would you summarize, for someone who's never heard of it, how would you explain why this foundation is so successful?
Well, first, the foundation had an endowment, which really helps foundations to do their not-for-profit work. And we had a board that was willing to let us experiment and reach out and do things that other organizations weren't doing in sport. First and foremost, we were providing bats and balls to kids, as one of our board members always said. We were also providing instruction on how to be coaches, so kids would enjoy their time in sport, which unfortunately, a lot of kids do not, because they know the coach doesn't know what they're doing. And they have a terrible time and never want to take part in that sport again. So we wanted to provide the knowledge for the coaches to be able to coach. And then we also have the library, which has the history and information, all sorts of information. It's the best sports library in the nation. The best Olympic library, of course, is in Lausanne, Switzerland. But ours is open, there's LA84 is open 24/7, 365, because it's all been digitized, which is just amazing. Just amazing.
That is very true. Please. So in '87, you join, you're elected to the International Olympic Committee. You write about 86. It in
86.
86, apologies. How would you write about it in your autobiography? Now looking back at it, how far has the IOC changed since that time?
Oh, light years. It's changed light years. Certainly, we've become larger. We have a new office building that got the highest rating for being environmentally friendly as buildings can be. So we've gotten larger. We have far more women involved than there used to be. We do more. Not only do we support a lot of National Olympic Committees and their athletes and federations, but we support causes. For example, we're helping to plant a forest across the Sahara to help bring back, we hope, some shade and trees and the biodiversity in those great sand dunes. We're very, worried about how we're treating the earth. So we've cut back enormously on our travel. So many of our meetings are done by Zoom, so that we can cut back on the travel and the cost of, and jet fuel and so forth. So we care about these things. We do our very best. We do.
There's been a lot of criticism of the IOC's decisions of where the Olympics would be hosted in recent years. Now, next year, they're going to be in Paris, and then 2028 back in LA. I was wondering, how do you think in the future, what will the impact be on the way the Olympics are organized?
Okay. I should be able to do this correctly, but I will not. I will say, when Thomas Bach became president, we undertook this study to look at everything the IOC did and to ask, is this what we should be doing, or what should we be doing? And we came up with this idea of the 20 things that IOC 2020. And we had certain goals to do things better by 2020. 2020 arrives, we have 2020 plus 5, and we have 5 more areas of goals. And those goals have to do with being good global citizens and hoping that the things that we do can be useful in other ways around the world, but sticking to the fact that what we are is a sports organization. We're actually a Swiss association is our legal status, and staying in our own lane. We are not government. We cannot tell a government to do this or that. We make an agreement with a city to host an event. That's what we do. Mm-hmm. And thus far, we've been able to make sure that the athletes have the opportunity to compete at that event.
In 2017, when you presented the bid for LA, again, I want to go back to this idea of like LA84 was a success story and we will replicate it. What will you do differently?
Oh gosh,
from 84.
It's a whole different time. We have different stadia. We have the old stadia. We have different transportation. There'll be 1 village instead of 3. So all the athletes actually will be together, except those who have to sleep on their boats. I know sailors are very specific. So there might be a few who sneak out, but they could all stay in the village. The village would be a great place as always, and I hope the athletes really enjoy it. I'm sure there are going to be some fun things cooked up for them to be doing, whatever is the fun thing to do in 2027. We don't know yet. I think it'll just be joyous because we like sport in Southern California. We appreciate excellence also. And that's what the Olympic Games are about. As I call them, they're a celebration of human excellence.
There was a protest movement against the bid, and so the No Olympics movement that was very active and very vocal.
And very wrong. Much of what they said was so wrong. It was unbelievable. But go ahead.
So they were tapping, I know you're already heading into that direction. So they were tapping in pre-existing criticism of the Olympic movement that it is precisely not sustainable, that profits are privatized, whereas most of the funding come from taxpayers' money and so forth. So if you want to summarize counter arguments, how would you do that?
Oh gosh, too many lies and not enough truth. That's how I'd summarize it. The truth is the contract is made with the city. The notion of the guarantee of the contract, that there has to be some other organization guaranteeing it, that's to protect the city. The guarantee has nothing to do with the IOC. It's only for the city. So the IOC, again, has nothing to do with the guarantee. The IOC pays its own way. We pay for our rooms. We pay for the cars that are necessary and all of those things that are necessary for us at the games. So we don't cost the organizing committee anything. It's up to the citizens of the city to determine how they're going to present the games. And we've been asking for cities that have games that won't, to have facilities so the games won't interfere, because we don't want to interfere with the city. We want the city to be joyous and be able to absorb the games without having to do, extraordinary things that cost extraordinary amounts and cause extraordinary pain. Not necessary. We have figured out sport well enough that you can use facilities innovatively.
We've not seen a major boycott since 1984. So also no Olympics for the upcoming games was not successful. How would you attribute that absence of a boycott to?
Well, boycotts hurt one group only, and that is the athletes. It hurts the athletes who are kept home, and it hurts the athletes who are competing without those athletes who are kept home. That is all that they do. I would add that they chip away at the luster of the Olympic movement as well, because this time, for example, they were going after some of the sponsors of the games. Well, the sponsors sign on for 4 to 8 to 12 years. So they can't just say, well, you know, blah, 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 we're no longer sponsoring these games because none of this money from us is going. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense to complain against sponsors because they are sponsoring a whole group of games and making it possible to democratize the Olympic movement so that we can support so many national Olympic committees and athletes and federations that otherwise would probably not at all exist.
You were an activist athlete yourself. How would you, in recent years, there's been criticism that athletes don't feel that they can always articulate their opinion freely, or they fear retaliation, penalties.
No. What they want,
yeah,
they can. They've never been shut up. Athletes have not been mugged or what's the right word?
Muzzled.
Muzzled. There we go. Not mugged, muzzled in any way. What they want is to use parts of the Olympic movement that are sacred. And we've all decided they're sacred because if you start playing with them, the whole point of the games will be destroyed. And what they want to do is to do that, which cannot be done. You know, you distract. If you want to say something, you know, who else is understanding what you're saying? With the other two, second or third, whatever they are, medalists understand what the heck you're protesting against. And you've just put the spotlight on you. So the other two groups of athletes are like, what are they? You know, it's not fair. It's just not fair. And it's pointless, as a matter of fact. It'll be over. You've had your moment. You've destroyed the moment for the other two. But how many people will understand what you were doing? Now, you have the whole 2 years before Paris to be working on those things that you want to work on. And you have the rest of your life after the games are over to work on that too. So why take this moment that's sacred to everyone else, or even in the venues when you're competing? To me, it's really, really being self-important.
What do you think has the end of the Cold War done for to the Olympic movement?
Well, we managed to go through 2 world wars, the Cold War, and now whatever it is we're in now, we're still around. And so it's caused the Olympic movement to, you know, sometimes squirm and wonder where we are and what we're going to do. What are we going to do about the Russian athletes and the Belarusian athletes if they pass their doping tests, first of all? First and most important, because the Russian drug lab still has not been certified as being right and just. So they'll have to have drug tests from labs that have been certified. But what do you do with an aggressor nation? We are not in the business of national stuff, so it's a tough thing for us to deal with.
You've been an integral member of the Olympic movement for decades now, and I was wondering if, when you look ahead, when you're looking at the future of the Olympic movement, where do you see areas that you still want to work on, where you hope to see some improvement? What are the goals that you have now?
To make, you know, the mission of the Olympic movement is to make a better world through sport. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got to make sure women are involved at every level and doing our fair share to make sure that sport endures and flourishes. And unfortunately, the world is not being easy to make nicer. So we have a lot of work to do in that. So at every level, there's much more to be done.
You've answered all the questions that I have at this point. Is there anything else you would like to add or share?
Well, again, I view the Olympic Games as a celebration of human excellence. It's true that we are all the same. We are one race, the human race. Everyone is the same, and yet we are each unique. Even identical twins are not identical. And we have the Olympic Games that proves, as well as anything else, that we are all the same. We are human.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. DeFrantz, for this conversation. I turned over to Seth.
Thank you.
Well, Victoria, thank you for being such a gracious and eloquent interviewer. This is very educational and very interesting for me as well. And Anita, you were brilliant as always in retelling, key parts of Olympic history and your place in it.
Thank you very much.